Good evening, dear guests, dear fellow students. On behalf of the krIPU, and thank you, Ben, on behalf of the krIPU, a student group for Kritik and Psychoanalysis, I too would like to welcome you to this evening and the second event of our lecture series, das ganze Grauen, Psychoanalytische Aufklärung nach dem 7. Oktober, which translates to the whole horror, psychoanalytic enlightenment or illumination after October 7. Our thanks go to the Stura and the friends and sponsors, Ben Saalfeld, whose financial support has made the realization of the series possible. I'm particularly pleased to welcome our speaker for tonight, Rosine Perelberg. I would also like to draw your attention to the next two events in the series. On Thursday, the day after tomorrow, the psychoanalyst and writer Samar Mani will analyze changes in the attitudes of parts of Iranian society towards Israel in light of the protest movements in recent years. And on Friday next week, on July 7, the philosopher Julia Christ will talk about the sexual crimes committed by Hamas men on October 7 and its concealment or denial by Western feminism. I will now say something about the occasion for the series before I introduce Rosine. The fact that the conditions that made Auschwitz possible still exist today, that is the whole horror. As Theodor Adorno said in his radio lecture, Education After Auschwitz. On October 7, this horror came to light in all its brutality when Hamas and its accomplices broke through the Israeli border and, in a carefully planned act of barbaric violence, carried out the worst massacre of Jews since the Shoah. October 7 marks a turning point, a rupture. In the days and weeks following October 7, I repeatedly found myself in conversations in which my friends and I shook our heads in disbelief, in a loss for words. Not just because what happened that day, but also because of the international reactions that had assumed a monstrous form. The painstakingly documented slaughter, torture, and rape by Hamas and its accomplices was denied, relativized, or declared an act of decolonial liberation. My friends and I were struck by the feeling that we were witnessing a collective psychosis that spanned an entire globe. This feeling has remained to this day. Anti-Semitic violence does not lead to a moral outcry, anger, or grief. No, it leads to an effective contamination, to a spreading of anti-Semitism. Nothing new, really. But how could anyone ever understand that? Especially when we are still in the midst of these events. 2 weeks ago, the Levetzowstraße Memorial, which is just a 50-minute walk from here, was sprayed with the following phrases: "Fuck Israel and free Palestine." The memorial is located on the site of a once-standing synagogue that was cynically misused by the Nazis as a gathering station for the deportation of Jews. The Tiergarten town hall, less than 10 minutes from here, was also the target of repeated attacks. On the night of May 9, an arson attack was carried out, and the following was sprayed on the walls of the building: "If Gaza burns, Berlin burns. Free Gaza, free Hamas." The town hall had previously been flying Israeli flags, which had been repeatedly torn down. And a little further on, also in Moabit, in a cafe in Beuselstraße on May 3rd, a man carrying an Israeli flag was insulted with anti-Israeli slurs, punched in the face with a fist, and robbed. And these are by no means the only attacks on Jewish and Israel solidary institutions and people and on the memory of the Holocaust, but only what happened here in Moabit, and only this month. And probably not even this list is complete. How is it possible to be reflective when we are still in the moment of trauma without the possibility of a passage of time that would allow for an après-coup? Rosine Perelberg asks in her announcement of tonight's lecture. And I think that's a very relevant question, also for the lecture series as a whole. Rosine Perelberg will need little introduction to a psychoanalytically informed audience. She's a distinguished fellow, training analyst, and former president of the British Psychoanalytic Society, visiting professor in the Psychoanalysis unit at University College London, and corresponding member of the Paris Psychoanalytic Society. She's written and edited 12 books, including Murdered Father, Dead Father, Revisiting the Oedipus Complex, published by the New Library of Psychoanalysis. On the last chapter of this very book, the article that Ben already mentioned on contemporary anti-Semitism is based on. The German translation was published last year, by the way. Rosine is a recipient of the 2023 Sigourney Award, which recognizes outstanding psychoanalytic work worldwide. She was recently appointed to the International Psychoanalytic Association as representative of the European region of the Community and the World Committee on Prejudice, Discrimination, and Racism. Rosine Perelberg, we are delighted to have you with us.
I want to thank very much for this invitation this evening and to say how moved I am to be with you here tonight and to know that you're interested in this theme. This is work in progress, so it's not a completed, polished paper because I'm still working on it. I'm very, very pleased to share it with you. I start with two quotations by Freud. One, in Analysis, Terminable and Interminable, he says, one feels inclined to doubt sometimes whether the dragons of primeval days are really extinct. And another quotation that one can find in Peter Gay, where he says, my language is German, my culture, my attainments are German. I considered myself German intellectually until I noticed the growth of anti-Semitic prejudice in Germany and German Austria. Since that time, I prefer to call myself a Jew. This paper aims to explore whether psychoanalysis has a contribution to offer to an understanding of the phenomenon of antisemitism, which has an extremely long history and is still at play in the present, including in the current Middle East conflict. It is not my argument that antisemitism explains the current conflict in the Middle East, although it is possible that it has had a role. I cannot in this paper go into the political and historical complexities of this highly charged conflict, which induces powerful emotions that too often submerge rationality and historical facts. Tragedy is the marker of the history of these two peoples, the Israelis and the Palestinians, a fratricidal conflict, in the words of Uri Avineri in 1967. Harari has recently written about the real threat of mutual annihilation that these two peoples face. My aim in this paper is to reflect on the intensification of antisemitism following the massacre of 7th of October. Throughout the ages, historians and specialists on antisemitism have been puzzled by its persistence. In 1993, Bela Grunberger suggested that the Jew has become a category which can quite naturally be applied to any enemy, real or imaginary. He is both the source of evil and a narcissistic wound. And he is a source of evil because he is a narcissistic wound. The Jew is a reminder of unwanted aspects of oneself, Thus, the multiplicity of negative attributes to the Jew, eternally a foreigner. The explosion of anti-Semitism in many parts of the world that followed the massacre of 7th of October perpetrated by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad against civilians in Israel has frightened many. The attack led to the slaughter of entire communities in Israel, with dehumanizing elements of exhibitionism, the videos produced by Hamas and posted on social media, perverse atrocities, torturing and raping women and girls and mutilating their bodies in front of their families, and extreme sadism, for instance, slashing women's breasts whilst raping them. Families were hunted in their homes and fields, captured at gunpoint. Many were hiding in secret rooms while gunmen searched their homes. This description is important, as you see later, what was actually done. It's very, very important. This was recorded in real time and shared in social media. The similarities between the descriptions of this pogrom and the medieval mass killings of Jews in Christian and Islamic societies, the Khmelnytski massacres of 1640s in Ukraine, the Russian pogroms between 1881 and 1920, or the German slaughter in 1942 in Bolshoi, make it more difficult to process it psychically. Yet, 3 days following the attack, and before Israel had invaded Gaza, celebrations of the massacre with open anti-Semitic chants inciting further violent acts against Jews took place in many parts of the world. Kill the Jews, Gas the Jews could be heard in the demonstration in Sydney near the Opera House. Over the next few months, incitement of violence against Jews intensified. The subsequent Israeli invasion of Gaza might have contributed to the increased manifestations of anti-Semitism worldwide, but it cannot be supposed to provide a sufficient explanation. Gunther Jekyll and his group at the Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism at Indiana University pointed out that there has been a radicalization of antisemitism in the media. No longer Jews just attacked and insulted, there is also incitement to kill the Jews. The blurring between the war in the Middle East, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism has been a phenomenon that deserves analysis. Many countries, including the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, witnessed an increase in the violence against the Jews. If, to start with, pictures of the civilian hostages taken by Hamas were being torn from public places, the next step was indeed acts of violence against Jews, a violence that seemed to have gained legitimacy. And I quote from Friedland, who is a journalist from The Guardian in London. Some of the incidents involved knives, others saw Jews struck with metal bars. Some victims were punched or kicked or spat on. Others had stones, bricks, or bottles thrown at them. Some had religious clothing, say the kippah or skull cap, forcibly removed. Some of the abuse happened online. Some of it was physical and personal. Some of it comprised attacks on buildings, slogans daubed on walls, windows smashed. Hundreds of incidents involving children, whether making their way to or from school or inside it. The responsibility for the violence of the war in Gaza was being attributed to the Jews around the world. Universities worldwide saw an increase in demonstrations and violence against Jewish students. According to the Security Community Trust in Britain, 60% of Jewish people in Britain have since hidden signs of their Jewishness in public. Why is the murder of Jewish people celebrated and legitimized by and across so many people and countries immediately after October 7th massacre? the celebrations indicated identification with the perpetrators and no sense of solidarity with the victims. The victims were being blamed as perpetrators in the process of projection, reversal, and denial. Such process of reversal and blaming the victim have been perennial occurrences in the history of antisemitism, creating justification for persecution and attempts at extermination. The process of blaming victims for their persecution has been identified as a characteristic of the persecution of minorities in general, according to René Girard. One cannot but evoke the notion of the compulsion to repeat, which Freud linked to the demonic, on the side of the death drive. While it is important to underline that a significant proportion of those marching in London in support of the Palestinians were genuinely concerned about the fate of the Palestinian people and wished an end to the war, other messages were being promulgated, such as "Stop this Holocaust." The Jews were being accused of being the neo-Nazis in a process of trivialization of the Holocaust. Yet, at the same time, the Holocaust as a signifier of the worst atrocities of the 20th century and 21st centuries has been used as a point of reference for suffering. It becomes an important process of appropriation. Bruckner has suggested a competition for the Holocaust among different groups, as if to say, Auschwitz is us. How can one account for this mass movement? Does psychoanalysis have conceptual tools to help the understanding of the explosion of antisemitism worldwide? How is it possible to be reflective if we are still in the moment of the trauma, with no possibility of a passage of time that would enable an après-coup to take place? Vulcan has described how traumatized societies regress and resort to splitting and projection. All nuance is lost. Excuse me. Issues and people become reduced to good or bad, friend or foe. Extreme polarization sets in, which is what is being lived through today. In this paper, I first examined some of Freud's ideas in relation to antisemitism. I then explore some of the conceptual tools that psychoanalysis has offered to the understanding of prejudice against different minorities in different moments in time. This is followed by an outline of the different political groups that seem to come together as in a perfect storm in relation to current antisemitism. I conclude with some theoretical considerations about the current phenomenon. Psychoanalysis has been indissolubly linked with antisemitism since its foundation, as well in its historical developments. Vienna, Berlin, and Budapest were the origin of the psychoanalytic movement, with most of the psychoanalysts being Jewish, living in an environment where antisemitism prevailed. This was the case until the exodus that followed Hitler's invasion and annexation of Austria and the institution of the Nuremberg laws. Some Jewish analysts were able to emigrate, including Freud and some of his family, who went to England where they were received by the British Psychoanalytical Society. Yet, the links between these two phenomena, psychoanalysis and antisemitism, and the specificity of antisemitism for psychoanalysis are not ordinarily reflected on in current discussions on prejudice and racism, and are rarely studied in the curriculum of candidates. I think here you're an exception, really. It's quite amazing and moving. So it's not usually present in the curriculum of candidates. How can one understand this phenomenon? Might this be understood as the rejection of the Jewish origins of psychoanalysis and the antisemitism embedded in psychoanalysis? Freud was acutely aware of being a minority throughout his life, in his condition as a Jewish man, in a process of geographical and social dislocation. This is clear in his autobiographical notes. He says, I was born on May 6, 1856, at Freiburg in Moravia, a small town in what is now Czechoslovakia. My parents were Jews, and I have remained a Jew myself. I have reason to believe that my father's family were settled for a long time on the Rhine, that as a result of a persecution of the Jews during the 14th or 15th century, they fled eastwards, and that in the course of the 19th century, they migrated back from Lithuania through Galicia into German Austria. When I was a child of 4, I came to Vienna, and I went through the whole of my education here. At the gymnasium, I was at the top of my class for 7 years. My deep engrossment in the Bible story had, as I recognized later, an enduring effect upon the direction of my interests. It is known that Amalie, Freud's mother, communicated with her children only in Yiddish, and that Freud was therefore fluent in this language. Many of the jokes that he refers to come from the lexicon of Yiddish jokes. It was only in 1867 the Jews were awarded equality before the law in Austria. So a few years earlier, Freud would not have been able to go to medical school. Even so, the numerous clauses quota for the Jews to be appointed as professor at the university was 2%. In the scientific discourse of the time, Jews defined what Aryans were not. Though Freud escaped to London, thanks to Ernest Jones and Princess Bonaparte, 3 of his theses were taken and killed in the camps. Freud's perception of his Jewish identity appears at intervals throughout his letters and books, and is thus an element that is present not only in his personal life and in the difficulties psychoanalysis had to struggle against the intellectual milieu of Freud's Vienna, but also in the development of the concepts of psychoanalysis itself. Freud was concerned that psychoanalysis was identified with Jewishness of its founders and the first collaborators, as he did not wish it to become a Jewish science. One can identify contradictory explanations. I'm so sorry about this. It's a pollen from London. One can identify contradictory explanations about antisemitism in his writings. On the one hand, Freud wrote about narcissism or small differences. It is those who are closer to us that we tend to transform into enemies, something that enhances the cohesion of groups. The other is endowed with unwanted characteristics. Freud thought that the dispersion of the Jews throughout Europe facilitated them being used as scapegoats. He says, in this respect, the Jewish people scattered everywhere have rendered the most useful services to the civilizations of the countries that have been their hosts. But unfortunately, all the massacres of the Jews in the Middle Ages did not suffice to make that period more peaceful and secure for their Christian fellows. The notion of narcissism of minor differences, which implies a familiarity with the neighbor, contrasts with another explanation for antisemitism, which is the foreignness of the Jews, that Freud also mentions. Fennikel suggests that antisemitism arises in periods of instability. Jews carry within themselves that which is murderous, dirty, and debauched. Psychoanalysis has formulated concepts to deepen our understanding of prejudice. Freud introduced the terms splitting, projection, and defense, along with denial and negation. Melanie Klein, Margaret Mahler, and Otto Kernberg deepen the understanding of such mechanisms. Further psychoanalytic developments introduce other terms, such as the need to have enemies, suggested by Volkan, villain hunger, a term suggested by Akhtar. Bollas has suggested the term fascist states of mind, whereby the qualities of the other are destroyed via the annihilation of the other. A delusional grandiosity forms in the fascistically stated mind. Volkan has offered a typology of prejudice from what he considers a mild form towards a severe one that can reach a stage of messianic sadism, which can lead to riots, mass killings, and genocide. He suggested the denial of the object's authenticity and goodness leads to a parallel and increasing distortion of self-representation. In a recent paper, I have suggested that in the hatred of the Jews, it is the Oedipus structure and the paternal function, the murder of the dead father, that are attacked. The three monotheistic religions have a kinship relationship within which the Jews retain the relationship to the Father of the law and the commandments. In her 2006 IPA report on prejudice, Janine Pouget identifies three sources of antisemitism, and I quote, "There are, however, signs of a creeping, partly unconscious antisemitism stemming from three main ideological and political sources. A, part of the Catholic world and of the political forces inspired by it, which follows the traditional pattern of anti-Judaism. B, part of the left, which distinguishes antisemitism as anti-Zionism and anti-Americanism. And C, the political forces inspired by fascism, which is still present. One can, however, identify at least a fourth source of anti-Semitic hatred. In addition to the traditional forms of anti-Semitism, rooted in a fantasy of Judaism that regards the Jews as the killers of Christ, constitutive of the history of the West, I would highlight the anti-Semitism rooted in fundamentalist versions of Islam. The word antisemitism came into use in the 19th century to describe pseudo-scientific racial discrimination against Jews, but it is now used more generally to describe all forms of discrimination, prejudice, or hostility towards Jews. It has been described as the longest hatred. Throughout the centuries, anti-Semitic tropes have been expressed in a vocabulary that sees the Jews as a deviant group in relation to the dominant ideologies at specific moments in time. The Jew is viewed as a foreigner, the stranger, despite at times having lived for centuries in the countries that have expelled or persecuted them. Unlike the persecution of other minorities, which are historically seen as victims, the persecution of the Jews throughout time has been framed in terms of conspiracy theories. This is based on two sets of beliefs. The first is the timeless accusation that the Jews are responsible for the murder of Christ and are seen as deicides, the killers of God. This accusation started with the birth of Christianity and has persisted throughout the centuries. It has been taken on by Islam, by Nazism, and Bolshevism. The murderousness of various regimes at different moments in time is projected onto the Jews. A derivative of this accusation is expressed in the blood libel or ritual murder, which accuses Jews of murdering Christian children in order to use their blood in the performance of religious rituals, especially as Passover. Throughout centuries, this accusation has led to atrocities committed against Jewish populations. If one could argue that to some extent religious beliefs have weakened their presence in contemporary society, and we're going to discuss this in a moment, one should not underestimate the presence of these narratives in the unconscious of people, as well as in folklore, myth, literature, and art. They are deeply embedded in Western history. The second set of beliefs construes the Jews as dangerous and plotting to control the world, of being untrustworthy and treacherous. This formulation found its manifestation in the Protocols of Elders of Zion, a fabricated piece of writing describing a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, which has been circulated worldwide and continued to be published widely. Throughout history, anti-Jewish attitudes have been taken many forms, including religious, nationalistic, political, economic, and racial. Antisemitism has adapted and changed the vocabulary it employs according to the dominant ideology that has prevailed in any society at any moment in time. When religion constituted the predominant framework for understanding the world, and Christianity was a dominant religion, the Jews constituted a deviant population that did not fit in. Expulsion of Jews were frequent, so that by the mid-1500s, Christians had emptied most of the Western Europe of Jews. After the creation of the modern states in Europe, the Jews had neither a state nor a national identity. As Bauman wrote, the world tightly packed with national states abhorred the non-national void. Jews were such a void. They were such a void. Antisemitism is embedded in Western culture in some of the most lauded names. David Rich in London, he mentions T.S. Eliot, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Emily Dickinson, Lord Byron, Anthony Trollope, to name just a few. He points out how the English Dictionary indicates the embeddedness of antisemitism in language. It lists pejorative expressions in which the term Jew is being used. For instance, someone, and I quote, regarded stereotypically as scheming or excessively concerned with making or saving money. Phrases like as rich as a Jew, or Jew broker, or Jew merchant are also indicated. There is also the verb to Jew, or to Jew down, meaning to try to get better of a person by charging too much or paying too little, to haggle, and to cheat or swindle. Christian and fascist anti-Semitism have been written about more widely. Here I shall briefly consider the two other forms of anti-Semitism, that of part of the political left and Islamic anti-Semitism. Islamic antisemitism refers to a specific ideology with specific emphasis, some of which were imported from Christian and Nazi antisemitism. Recent research, just published, has unearthed documents on the relationship between Nazism and the Arab countries in the Middle East in the 1930s and 40s. The archives consulted also revealed the close collaboration between Joseph Goebbels and the Muslim Brotherhood. Just to give an example, Rudolf Hess' family, Hitler's henchman, had resided in Alexandria since the middle of the 19th century. In 1926, his brother began to organize an Egyptian section of the Nazi foreign organizations, which counted several hundred members. Until the beginning of the war in 1939, the Brotherhood was supported by a department of the Nazi Ministry of Propaganda. In 1936, the Brotherhood called for boycott of Jewish businesses in Egypt. The Brotherhood increased to 200,000 members. By 1945, it had become the most influential mass movement and most important purveyor of Islamic antisemitism in the Arab world. These studies detail a denial of the Holocaust in the Middle East and point out that it was the Nazis themselves who brought genocidal antisemitism to the Arab world. There are similarities between the anti-Jewish caricatures in the Middle East and those produced by the Nazis. and Arab editions of Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion continue to be published and disseminated in Arab countries. Kunzel, I think he wrote originally in German. I don't know if you know his work. Maybe some of you might. Kunzel suggests that under the influence of this penetration, the image of the Jew changed radically in the Arab world between the years of 1937 and 1948. Haj Amin al-Husseini, in 1937, published a text called Islam and the Jews, and this text is considered the founding document of Islamic anti-Semitism. If you're interested, it's really worth reading it because it's really so shocking. So this text is the sole purpose being to incite Jew hatred in the region. Kunzel suggests that this document shows genocidal Jew hatred to be the cause and not a consequence of the later crisis in the Middle East. I found this passage and I wanted to read to you that in Islam and Judaism, the hadith is, as you probably know, is considered to be the passing down of the words of Muhammad. So there's a very famous hadith of the tree and the stone that was, one encounters the same hadith in Hamas charter. And a lot of what happened on the 7th of October is a literal put into practice, the hadith. And the hadith says, the hour, the resurrection, will only come when the Muslims have inflicted a crushing defeat on the Jews, when every stone and every tree behind which a Jew has hidden, says to the Muslim, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. The Arabs viewed the Jews in this massive propaganda that was taking place as a mortal danger that needed to be destroyed. Kunzel suggests that this anti-Semitic genocidal propaganda was one of the decisive factors that led to the Arab states going to war against Israel in May 1948 and to the non-acceptance of the United Nations resolution for the partition of Palestine between Israel and the Palestinians. He suggests it was not post-war Zionism that led to anti-Semitism in the Middle East. Rather, it was the anti-Semitism that was previously fanned and inflamed that produced a subsequent conflict and its intensification. Between 1922 and 1936, al-Husseini emphasized the religious life or death war against the Jews. The emphasis was on the idea that the Jews intended to destroy the Islamic holy places. A territorial conflict was turned into a religious war. The continuous multiple publications of these anti-Semitic texts, which were used for teaching in schools, attest to the specific image of the Jew that has prevailed in the region. The historian Ben Soussan in France has written about this. It is known that the Muslim leader Amin al-Husseini established an alliance with Mussolini, Hitler, Himmler, and other Nazi leaders in the early 40s. He expressed his support for the final solution of the Jewish problem and considered the fascists and the Nazis as allies in the struggle against the common enemy. The original Hamas Charter, the 1988 version, identified Hamas as the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine and described its members to be God-fearing Muslims raising the banner of jihad. The introduction of the charter identifies Hamas' struggle as a continuation of, and I quote, our long and dangerous struggle with the Jews. That charter emphasizes four main themes. One, denying Israel and establishing Islamic theocracy in Palestine as essential. Two, unrestrained jihad is being necessary to achieve this. Three, negotiated solution of Jewish and Palestinian claims to the land or unacceptable. And four, historical anti-Semitic tropes, which reinforce all the above. The Charter proclaims that Israel will exist until Islam obliterates it, and jihad against Jews is required until Judgment Day. Compromise over the land is forbidden. The document promotes holy wars, divinely ordained, reject political solutions, and call for instilling these views in children. The updated 2017 Charter appeared to moderate Hamas' position by stating, so substituting all word Jews by Zionists, stating that Hamas is anti-Zionist, but it retains the goal of eliminating Israel. Its claim that it's no longer anti-Semitic has been refuted numerous times to the actions of Hamas, as well as the statements of its leaderships, including Fatih Hamad, who has publicly called for the killing of Jews. There's more, but I'm going to jump to anti-Semitism and the left. The relationship between anti-Semitism and the left has been more recently underlined by, for example, Fine and Spencer, Poston suggests that a dimension of the shift towards anti-Semitism on sections of the anti-imperialist left, especially in Europe, can be analyzed as the return of the repressed, as it has been part of the European tradition. Postpone has reflected on the processes that took place in both the communist and the Western worlds. He says, not only was anti-Semitism downplayed in the post-war communist world, but relatedly the victimization of Jews as Jews. It is remarkable that although many monuments to the victims of Nazism were later erected in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, almost none of them mention the Jews. As, for example, the massacre of 33,000 Jews in the 2 days in September 1941 by the Nazi and Ukrainians in Babi Yar, just outside Kiev, was not commemorated for years. When a monument was erected in 1976, it referred to the execution by the German fascist invaders of citizens of Kiev and prisoners of war, but did not mention that the victims were Jews. In Soviet documents, Jewish victims were frequently only referred to as peaceful Soviet citizens. Even the memorial at Auschwitz, erected in 1967, was titled International Monument to the Victims of Fascism, thereby eradicating the specificity of the Holocaust and of the Jews as victims of attempted extermination. The former Soviet Union has played a key role in this phenomenon. One is reminded of the anti-Semitic tradition within it, including the purging of Jews in Czechoslovakia in 1952 and Poland in 1968. Between 1948 and 1953, anti-Semitic accusations increased throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, which included the uncovering of a doctor's plot in Moscow, in which doctors were accused of being part of an international Zionist plot planning to poison the Soviet leadership. There were plans for a mass roundup of Soviet Jews and for the construction of gigantic camps for them, which were then dropped with the death of Stalin in 1953. After the Arab-Israeli conflict in 1967, the Soviet Union sponsored a form of anti-Zionism that was essentially anti-Semitic. Zionism as a singularly evil, as constituting a global conspiracy. The familiar anti-Semitic formulation about the Jews. It was from here that the first slogans between Zionism and Nazism were derived. Between 1969 and 1985, anti-Semitic books proliferated in the Soviet Union with 230 titles on the subject of a non-existent Zionist Masonic conspiracy against Russia. These books had a combined print of 9.4 million volumes. Radio Moscow broadcasts more than 1,000 hours a week in 80 languages to Europe and the Middle East and the Americas, convey intense propaganda equating Nazism with Zionism. This was the topic of Mahmoud Abbas' PhD dissertation. You probably know that, which was undertaken in Moscow and published in 2011 under the title, The Other Side, The Secret Relationship Between Nazism and Zionism, which, among other themes, casts doubt on the number of Holocaust victims. In the West, anti-colonial struggles became the primary focus for much of the New Left, expressing a radical critique of Western capitalist society translated into nationalist and culturalist terms. However, as Postman points out, an opposition to an imperial power is not necessarily progressive. There were fascist anti-imperialism as well. Then parts of the New Left turned to the Palestinians as a focus of their anti-colonial struggles beginning after 1967. Zionism was perceived as and treated as a malevolent global force, so immensely powerful that it can even determine the policies of the American superpower. Among a great deal of the so-called left, sentiments and criticism towards the State of Israel retranslate and retrospectively deny the value present in its own creation. Yet, on 20th of November 1947, when the United States approved the partition plan, it was supported by 33 nations, including the United States and Soviet Union. 30 nations, mainly the Arab League, opposed to it. In a poll conducted in 2003 by the European Commission, 7.5 respondents were asked which country posed the greatest threat for peace. Israel came top, scoring higher than Iraq, Iran, China, Russia, or North Korea. Postman suggests that the dimension of the shift towards antisemitism among sections of the anti-imperialist left, especially in Europe, can be analyzed as the return of the repressed. The emergence of the Holocaust on the surface of consciousness in the 1960s as a public memory mobilizes the same time process of denial. According to Marceline Loredan-Evans, she says, it involves denial of what has already emerged on the surface. They will never forgive us the harm they did to us. Modern antisemitism attributes great power to the Jews, but that power is not concrete and physical. Rather, is abstract, universal, intangible, and global. And I quote for Postman, within this Manichaean worldview, the struggle against the Jews is a struggle for human emancipation. Freeing the world involves freeing it from the Jews. Extermination is a logical consequence of this Weltanschauung. Jews are also seen as the foreigners that challenges universalistic causes. Israel threatens the geographical and population continuity of the Arab world. Located in Africa and Asia, these Arab nations combined have a total of over 5 million square miles, with 300 million inhabitants, 1 billion people in the broader Islamic world. The presence of Israel interrupts this hegemony. The question of who is a minority is a complex one, to say the least. In the words of Routledge she's a rabbi, former rabbi in Paris. She says, for the world to be at peace, it has to get rid of all that splits it apart, which is that which the Jews represent. Recent research on the anti-Semitic slogans carried in marches in London indicates that some of them were derived from anti-Semitic banners in the Soviet Union. There's a webinar online, if you're interested, by this Tabarovsky, is a scholar, and she puts together the banners, some of the banners in London against some of the banners that were present in the Soviet Union in the early 20th century. It's very striking. In recent times, with the development of decolonization studies, especially in universities and psychoanalytic institutions, Jews have been assimilated into white colonialism and a dichotomic vision of the world that reduces understanding to colonized or colonized. This dichotomy has marginalized Jews in the struggle against racism. As Montefiore has correctly explained, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, the decolonization narrative is dangerous and false. It does not accurately describe either the foundation of Israel or the tragedy of the Palestinians, and is long overdue for serious challenge. It is a perspective, this is me now, it is a perspective that ignores the history of antisemitism as a structural and violent form of prejudice. Most Israeli citizens were born in Israel, and unlike colonialists, they do not have other place to return. Furthermore, most Jewish Israelis are not white. They are the offsprings of North African, Middle Eastern, and Ethiopian families. This dichotomic view is what enables the silence of the left in relation to the Russian invasion of Ukraine or Sadat's murder of 500,000 civilians. One can identify this thinking Judith Butler's insistence on, and I quote, understanding Hamas and Hezbollah as social movements that are progressive, that are on the left, they are part of the global left, unquote. Postman suggests that modern antisemitism involves a turning biological, of capitalism, which itself is only understood in terms of its manifest abstract dimension and international Jewry. According to this interpretation, the Jews were identified not merely with money, with the sphere of circulation, but with capitalism itself. When one examines, I quote, when one examines the specific characteristic of the power attributed to the Jew by modern antisemitism, abstractness, intangibility, universality, mobility, it is striking that there are characteristics of the value dimension of the social forms analyzed by Marx. The aspects of invisibility and abstraction that he emphasizes led me back to a reading of Freud's Moses and the Monotheism, and the links between the invisible, all-powerful God and the paternal function. Moses and the monotheism represents the culmination of Freud's work on the father and articulates his view of the role of the God in monotheistic religions, especially Judaism and Christianity. He sees a link between the paternal function and monotheism in terms of an all-powerful God who is also invisible and inaccessible through the senses. A question then arises about the links between the two, the invisible God and the invisible link that relates a child to his father and to the paternal function. What is at stake is the reinvention of a new concept of father, which insists on its legislative function. It is the culmination of Freud's path in the conceptualization of the dead father and its function in the creation and maintenance of the law. Moreover, monotheism also emphasizes the existence of a law that's universal and thus opposed to the narcissistic universe. The role of the father and patricide thus becomes central in Freud's thinking. Freud suggests that if Judaism is the religion of the father, Christianity is the religion of the son, although the son takes the place of the father himself. Freud says Christ the Son took his place just as every son had hoped to do in primeval times. Antisemitism that can thus be understood, this is again me saying, as a wish for patricide, the killing of the Jewish father, the father of the law. In the text written in 1939, with Hitler already in power, one can understand Freud's reference to the progressive legalization of antisemitism in Nazi Germany. Is it that perennial antisemitism continually expresses its hatred towards the paternal function and the symbolic dead father? Is the creation of the Jew as the object which I described in relation to the camps, I suggested that it is the Oedipus structure that's being attacked. Furthermore, the oral and anal accusation, the blood libel, and the Jew as the devil, express aggression towards the pre-Oedipal phallic mother as a source of danger and associations to the Jew as the devil himself. Nearly there. Grunberger, a quotation from Grunberger: "The devil with his colors, his odors, and his manners represents the excremental world." Smirgel held that in Nazi ideology there is a stated attempt to return to a state of symbiosis with the Earth Mother, the subject's body, the body of the German people, Aryans, which is to become one with the body of the Mother, the German homeland, the whole Earth. Once all obstacles preventing this union have been swept away. The Nazi hypothesis emphasizes that blood, race, and earth are consubstantial. I quote from her: "The doctrine, blood and soil, brings another dimension to this need for homogeneity. It introduces a biological dimension, an expression of concrete thought without transposition, without substitution, as if the human race had returned to a form of mental functioning without symbols, to a time when no ram had as yet taken place in the sacrifice of Isaac." The return to a time where no ram has yet taken place is a time when children were still demanded and sacrificed by the narcissistic father. This is a reference to a paper I wrote about the binding of Isaac. And I suggest in that paper that because usually the discussions about that text raise the question, how on earth could God ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? And in my paper, I turned the question around because I then was interested in the fact that he did not kill the son. And I suggested in my paper that that's the passage from the narcissistic father who has right of life and death over their son to the dead father that prohibits all killings. This is a time when the sacrifice of children were very common in that region. So this is what I'm referring to here, because then a ram is sacrificed instead. So when I'm quoting from Smirgel, I say the return to a time when no ram had as yet taken place is a time when children are still demanded and sacrificed by the narcissistic father. The identification with the father of the horde justifies any atrocity as it is being committed against this higher ideal. Thus, one has a configuration by there's a victim, the perpetrator, and the ideal, which is to clean the world. In the destructions of the rules of genealogy and filiation, the paternal function is abolished. The Oedipus complex is the first symbolic structure in which the differences between the generations and the sexes are violated. And then I quote from Shmuel Ehrlich when he says, antisemitism becomes equated with the hatred for the life-giving parents. In group psychology and the analysis of the ego, Freud points out the specific dynamics when groups get together to allow the individual to throw off the repressions of his unconscious instincts. The apparently new characteristics which he then displays are in fact the manifestations of this unconscious, in which all that is evil in the human mind is contained as a predisposition. Individual responsibility disappears, the superego is weakened, projection processes become dominant, and there's a strong identification with a leader. Freud says, the notion of impossibility disappears for the individual in a group. Everything is possible. And it is very striking because these are almost the same words that Trotsky used in relation to the pogrom in Odessa, when there's a whole description of what took place in Odessa. And he says, the killer of the Jew is king. You become elevated because you're in this spree of killing. And it's very striking, too, because the Trotsky description of the pogrom in Odessa in 1905 is strikingly similar to what happened on October 7. I suggest that we are here in the domain of the narcissistic father of totem and taboo, where everything is possible. The killer of the Jews is king. Thus, in identification with the narcissistic father of the primitive horde. Acts of violence that would not be possible for the individual alone become possible in a group, which then becomes a mob. Discussing a way of defenses and censorship may be one of the dimensions of some manifestations in large groups following October 7, clamor for the killing of Jews. Anti-Semitic discourse that may have been unacceptable in ordinary times is now in the open. However, how to explain anti-Semitic manifestations around the globe? With so many disasters, why the concentration on the Jew? René Girard highlights our propensity to victimize or scapegoat. He described an unconscious tendency to both ascribe blame and to imbue the accuser with a sacred mystique. In times of crisis, institutions are weakened in favor of mob formation. This emotionally cathartic scapegoat mechanism, according to him, enhances social cohesion and was at the origin of religion, mythology, sacrifice, ritual, cultural institutions, and social norms. He stresses that the persecutors believe in the guilt of their victims. They are imprisoned in the illusion of persecution that is no simple idea, but a full system of representation. But there's still the question, with so many devastating crises in the world, why the concentration on the Jews, and how to understand the lack of condemnation for the massacre on the 7th of October. Stephen Frosch has suggested, and I quote, "The Jew is a principle of otherness for the West, articulating through contrast what is safe and unitary by embodying difference. The 2,000-year history of Christian anti-Semitism has created a figure that's more than a symbol of the splits in Western society. The Jew is rather the kernel of otherness, that which perhaps found everywhere, yet never to be allowed in. Inchoate fantasies of purity opposed by Jewish corruption, of secret societies and conspiracies." In a previous paper, I suggested that the perennial anti-Semitism continually expresses its hatred towards the paternal function and the symbolic dead father, the father of the law that prohibits murder and incest. Perhaps this formulation may also offer an understanding for the crucial relevance of the extreme violence perpetrated against women on the 7th of October, the gang rapes and mutilations. They signify a return to a lawless world and the destruction of the paternal function. The violence was also perpetrated against the difference between genders and generations. It was addressed to whole families, men, women, and children, in front of each other. The current increase in anti-Semitic manifestations around the world exposes a structural anti-Semitism that is endemic and flares up in times of discontent. It is thus embedded in the fabric of the social and erupts periodically. I have identified at least 4 main origins and manifestations of this anti-Semitism in current times: a traditional Christian anti-Semitism, a fascist, right-wing anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitism of the left, and radical Islamic anti-Semitism. We have indicated some overlap between these different sources. The relevance of religion in the resurgence of anti-Semitism also needs further reflection. I finish with a letter that Freud wrote in 1938 to Margaret, Lady Rhonda, the founder of Time and Tide, in response to her request for contribution to a supplement on the persecution of the Jews. Freud wrote, "I came to Vienna as a child of 4 years from a small town in Moravia. After 78 years, including more than a half-century of strenuous work, I had to leave my house, saw the scientific society I had founded dissolved, our institutions destroyed, our printing press, Verlag, taken over by the invaders, the books I had published confiscated and reduced to pulp, my children expelled from their professions. Don't you think the columns of your special number might try to be reserved for the utterances of non-Jewish people less personally involved than myself? I feel deeply affected by the passage in your letter acknowledging a certain growth of antisemitism even in this country. Ought this present persecution not rather give rise to a wave of sympathy in this country?" Thank you very much.